March 15th, 2024, 3:17 in the morning. That's when I crossed out the same line for the third time this week. My wrinkled fingers grip this old fountain pen like it weighs 50 pounds, and maybe it does. Maybe the weight of truth gets heavier with every year you carry it. The line reads, "I never told you about the baby we lost before you were born." 15 words, 68 years of silence, and every single time I write them down, my hand betrays me and draws that thick black line right through the middle. The paper underneath my desk lamp is a graveyard of failed attempts. Crumpled balls of cream stationery scattered around my chair like fallen leaves. Each one contains the same confession, the same cowardice, the same thick black line. At 95, you'd think I'd have run out of things to be afraid of. Death doesn't scare me anymore. Pain is an old friend. But telling my daughter Sarah about her older brother Thomas still makes my chest tighten like a vice. Thomas would have been 70 this year. He lived for exactly 43 minutes on a cold February morning in 1954. Born too early, too small, too fragile for this world. The doctors at St. Mary's Hospital said there was nothing they could have done. Sometimes babies just aren't meant to stay, they told me, as if that was supposed to make the ache in my chest disappear. Harold, my husband, held my hand while they wheeled me out of the delivery room. We never spoke about Thomas after that day. Not once in 47 years of marriage. Not when Sarah was born 18 months later. Not when she struggled to have children of her own. Not even when Harold was dying and had plenty of opportunities to unburden his soul. We buried Thomas in Greenwood Cemetery under a small stone that simply says, Baby Morrison, 1954. We visited every year on his birthday until Harold's arthritis got too bad to make the trip. After Harold died, I kept going alone. Every February 12th, I'd drive my old Buick to that hillside and sit beside that tiny grave, telling Thomas about his sister, about the grandchildren he never met, about the life he missed. Sarah thinks I go to visit Harold's grave. She doesn't know about the smaller plot 20 yards away, where her brother rests under a maple tree that's grown tall and strong in the decades since we lost him. The guilt of keeping this secret has eaten away at me like cancer. Not just the secret of Thomas, but the secret of why we never tried to have another baby right away. The secret of why I was so terrified when I got pregnant with Sarah. The secret of why I counted every single day of Sarah's pregnancy like a prisoner marking time on a cell wall. Sarah was born healthy and perfect, but I couldn't shake the fear that God might take her too. I hovered over her crib for months, checking her breathing every few minutes. Harold thought it was normal first-time mother anxiety. He never knew that technically Sarah wasn't my first baby. She was my second chance. When Sarah grew up and started having trouble conceiving, she came to me with tears in her eyes. "Mom, what if I'm not meant to be a mother? What if there's something wrong with me?" she asked. I held her close and told her to keep trying, that babies come when they're supposed to come. But what I should have told her was that sometimes they don't stay, and it's not your fault, and the pain never really goes away, but it does learn to live quietly in the corner of your heart. I should have told her about Thomas. I should have prepared her for the possibility of loss. Instead, I protected her from a truth that might have helped her understand that grief and hope can exist in the same space. Sarah eventually had 2 beautiful children, my grandchildren Emma and David. They're grown now with families of their own. Emma lives in Portland with her husband and twin boys. David's in the Navy, stationed in Norfolk. They visit when they can, but at my age, I know these visits are becoming more precious and fewer. That's why I started writing this goodbye letter in the first place. I want them to know things about their family history that I've never shared. Stories about their grandfather Harold's time in Korea, about how we met at a church dance in Cedar Rapids, about the small house we built with our own hands on Maple Street. But every time I get to the part about Thomas, my courage fails me. How do you tell your family about a person they never knew existed? How do you explain a 68-year silence about their uncle, their brother, their grandson? Most people would have walked away by now. But something tells me you understand complicated family secrets. Hit subscribe if you want to hear how this story ends. Last week, something happened that changed everything. Emma was visiting with her twins, and we were looking through old photo albums in my living room. The boys were fascinated by the black and white pictures of their great-grandparents, asking questions about every face they didn't recognize. That's when Emma found a photograph I thought I'd hidden away decades ago. It was tucked behind a picture of Harold in his army uniform, a hospital bracelet from St. Mary's with Thomas's information on it. February 12, 1954. Baby boy Morrison, 2 pounds, 3 ounces. Emma held it up with curiosity. Grandma, what's this? Were you in the hospital before Dad was born? My throat went dry. I could have made up a story about appendicitis or some other medical issue. Instead, I heard myself saying, "That's from when I had your Uncle Thomas." Emma's eyes widened. Uncle Thomas? Dad never mentioned an Uncle Thomas. That's when the dam broke. 68 years of stored-up grief came pouring out in my living room while my great-grandsons played with their toy trucks on the carpet. I told Emma everything about the pregnancy we thought was progressing normally, about going into labor 3 months early on a February morning so cold that ice covered the windows of Harold's Ford, about holding Thomas for those 43 precious minutes while Harold sang "You Are My Sunshine" in his shaky voice, about the funeral that only Harold and I attended because we were too ashamed to tell anyone we'd lost a baby. Emma cried with me that afternoon. She said she wished she'd known about Thomas sooner, that it might have helped her understand why I was so anxious when she was pregnant with the twins. Grandma, this isn't something to be ashamed of. This is part of our family story. Someone once told me there are rules that change after 60. One of them says that shame after 60 isn't protection, it's poison. I wish I'd known that 20 years ago. If you want to know what those rules are, it's in the description. That night, Emma called her father. Sarah drove over the next morning, and for the first time in 7 decades, I talked about my firstborn son. Sarah held my hands, these same wrinkled hands that have crossed out that line so many times, and told me she understood why I'd kept this secret. You were protecting me from something you thought would hurt, she said. But Mom, knowing about Thomas doesn't hurt. It helps me understand you better. We drove to Greenwood Cemetery that afternoon, all 3 generations of Morrison women. Emma brought flowers, white roses that reminded me of the tiny bouquet Harold had placed on Thomas's grave all those years ago. Sarah knelt beside her brother's headstone and whispered, "I'm sorry I never got to meet you, but I'm glad I finally know you existed." Standing there in that cemetery, watching my daughter and granddaughter honor a brother and uncle they'd never known, I realized something important. The line I'd been crossing out in my goodbye letters wasn't the real truth I needed to tell. The real truth was this. I was so afraid of your pain that I forgot you were strong enough to handle it. That's the line that matters. That's the confession that needed to be written. For 68 years, I'd been protecting my family from grief that wasn't mine to carry alone. I'd been deciding what they could and couldn't handle, what they should and shouldn't know about their own history. In trying to shield them from loss, I'd stolen their chance to understand resilience. Sarah had experienced her own fertility struggles without knowing that loss was part of our family story. Emma had navigated the fears of new motherhood without understanding that anxiety about children's safety ran in our blood for real reasons. They'd both been walking through experiences I could have helped them understand, if only I'd been brave enough to share the map. That evening I sat down at this same desk under this same lamp and wrote my fourth goodbye letter. This time, when I got to the difficult part, I didn't write about the baby we lost. Instead, I wrote about the family we found in the aftermath of that loss. I wrote about how Harold and I learned to be grateful for each day we had together, how losing Thomas made us appreciate every milestone Sarah reached, how that early grief taught us that love isn't diminished by loss, it's refined by it, concentrated into something more precious and intentional. I wrote about the visits to Thomas's grave, about the conversations I'd had with a son who never got to grow up, about how those one-sided talks had helped me work through fears and decisions over the years. I wrote about the maple tree that had grown over his grave, how its roots had probably reached his tiny casket by now, how that thought brought me comfort instead of sadness. Everything I learned about grief, about family secrets, about the difference between protection and isolation. It's all in something called the 60-year rule. 9 rules that changed everything about how I see relationships after 60. It helped me understand why keeping Thomas a secret had actually caused more harm than sharing his story ever could have. The link is in the description below. Don't wait as long as I did. The fourth letter sits finished on my desk now. No crossed out lines. It tells the complete Morrison family story, including the chapters I thought were too painful to share. Sarah and Emma both read it while I watched, tears streaming down faces that looked so much like mine did 70 years ago. "Mom," Sarah said, folding the letter carefully, "thank you for finally trusting us with this." Emma nodded. "Grandma, we're stronger than you thought we were. We always have been." They were right. I'd spent nearly 7 decades underestimating the people I loved most. I'd confused protection with control, love with secrecy. The truth is, families aren't fragile things that break when you share difficult stories. They're more like that maple tree growing over Thomas's grave. They get stronger when their roots go deeper, when they're nourished by the full truth of where they came from. This morning, I drove to Greenwood Cemetery one more time, but this time I wasn't alone. Sarah sat beside me in the passenger seat, and Emma followed in her own car with the twins. 4 generations of Morrisons, finally complete. We brought more white roses and a small American flag for the Memorial Day weekend. The boys, now 8 years old, asked thoughtful questions about their great-uncle Thomas. "Did he look like us, great-grandma?" one of them asked. I told them I thought he would have, especially around the eyes. That's where the Morrison genes show up strongest. As we stood around that small grave, I realized this was the ending Thomas's story deserved. Not silence and secret visits, but acknowledgement and integration into our family narrative. He wasn't a tragedy to be hidden. He was our beginning, the first Morrison baby, the one who taught us how precious every moment really is. Emma suggested we start visiting every year as a family tradition. "Thomas should be part of our Memorial Day visits," she said. "He's family too." Sarah agreed, and even the twins seemed to understand the importance of including their great-uncle in family memories. On the drive home, Sarah asked me if I had other secrets I'd been carrying. I laughed and told her that after 68 years, Thomas was the biggest one. But then I admitted there were smaller stories I'd love to share. About her father's first job at the grain elevator. About the time we almost moved to California. About the Christmas when we had no money for presents, so Harold carved wooden toys for her by hand. "I'd love to hear all of those stories, Mom," she said, "while we still have time." That's what I've been missing all these years. The "while we still have time" part. I've been so focused on protecting everyone from pain that I'd forgotten we're all temporary here. The stories, the truth, the complete picture of who we are. That's what lasts after we're gone. Tonight, as I sit at this desk for what might be the last time writing a goodbye letter, I'm not crossing out any lines. Every word stays. Every truth gets told. Every person in our family story gets acknowledged, including the ones who couldn't stay long enough to tell their own stories. Thomas Morrison lived for 43 minutes in 1954, but his impact on our family lasted 70 years. That's not a story to hide. That's a legacy to honor. And finally, at 95 years old, I'm brave enough to write it down without crossing it out.